Welcome to the Formalize tutorial video about preferences. The Formalize preferences are pretty straightforward. There aren't too many of them. You can get to them on the main admin page. There's just a link over here to the preferences. You can also get to them through modules, forms, preferences. Yeah, normally you would just be on the main admin page, and here you go. So what have you got? Well, what is the default width for all text boxes, and what are the default rows and columns for text areas or multi-line text boxes? So when you create one of those elements, it's going to have a default number of default numbers for these various size choices, and well, this is where those are specified. If you want all of your text areas to have be much wider than 35, then change this number, and then every time you create one, it'll use that number instead. You won't have to keep changing it over and over again. It doesn't affect none of these changes affect existing elements. Those just affect when you create new ones. What are the defaults? Default delimiter for checkboxes and radio buttons, line break or white space. You can pick either of those as the default. The line break is normally preferred. It just makes it much more clear what the separation is between the elements, but you can change that if you want. There's an older option here. Which form are you going to use as part of the registration process when viewing and editing user accounts, and requires use of the registration codes module. Some older things that Formalize interacted with older versions of Zoops to extend the profiles for users, and that was a feature that's related to that. But if you're not using an older version of Zoops, that's actually not applicable. This is one that people often interact with. Should the All Done button appear at the bottom of the form when editing an entry and creating a new entry in a one entry per user form? The All Done button appears actually in a few different situations, not just when creating a new entry in a one entry per user form. If you've followed through some of the other videos, you'll have seen the All Done button at the bottom, and you use it to basically leave the form and return to where you were. Essentially, some users don't want to have that extra button there. When they click Save, they want to leave the form and go back. By default, we show the form again, usually. Unless you're adding multiple entries in a form, then we show the form blank and you can fill it in again. And in that case, you need the All Done button, because if you're filling in the form new one every time, it keeps reloading as a blank every time. You can't click Save to leave. You obviously have to have another button to leave. So the All Done button is necessary in that case, and will always show up in that case, no matter what you say here. But in a more traditional situation where you're just making an entry, such as, I'll just jump into the form here. Well, say if I edit Randy's entry, we get Save and All Done. Some people don't want the difference there. They want to make some changes. They click Save, and they want to immediately leave the form and go back here. So if that's what you want, then you can say no to turn off the All Done button. Should the All Done button appear at the bottom of the form? No. And then that's a global setting. It'll turn the All Done button off, and it'll turn the Save button basically into Save and Done. The drawback is some users want some reassurance that the information they've typed in has actually been saved. So the form reloads and it shows them their information. It gives them that clarity that, okay, I typed this in, I click Save, I can see that it's now been saved, and then they click Done and they leave. So a lot of the things in Formalize where we have a choice, we tend to err on the side of what's going to be easiest for the sort of lowest common denominator of user. The intention is to not trip people up, and hopefully it's not a burden on more advanced users. But it's up to you how you want to deal with that, and you have a preference here to control that. Maximum number of entries that should be displayed in a list of entries without confirmation that the user wants to see them all. Especially in older versions of Formalize, there were definite performance issues if you had even really a moderate number of entries. That's not been the case for a while. The database layer is quite performant. at this point in version 4 and in version 3 as well. But it's still depends on your bandwidth connection and so on. If you've got a list of 1,000 entries, that could be a lot of HTML that is needing to load in the user's browser. Maybe you don't want to give that to them right away. So there's a maximum number here. We set it at 5,000, reasonably high, I think. And if when you're loading a list, Formulaiz detects that you've got more than that number of entries that are going to come back to you, it gives you a confirmation. It says, are you sure you actually want to load all of these? It could take a little while, if only because of the connection. The connection to the web server. So you can change that if you want to make it higher or lower. It's generally not an issue. Most of the time people are only seeing maybe 100 entries on a page, but as you'll see in other videos, it's possible to say no limit. You could have a page that had no limit on the number of entries that were being displayed, and so in that case you may want to have this limit here as a backstop against loading 100,000 records all at the same time. Security token system. Oh, and yes, you can see the question mark icons here cause a great deal of explanation to show up in some cases. So anyway, there we go. The security token system. There is a cross-site request forgery tokens, an anti-cross-site request forgery token system in Formulaiz. That's a lot of mumbo jumbo. Basically means it's a security system that will help in situations where someone's trying to fake a form submission to your website. So you can, this is on by default. In certain situations, because of the way the the security token system works, you may want to actually turn this off if your users are behind certain firewalls, or if in other cases where you may have multiple page loads from the user. They load a form, then they load a bunch of other pages, then they submit the form. Sometimes that kind of a workflow happens, and in that case the token will not work right because it expects that you're not loading any forms between, you load a form, you fill it in, you submit it, and that's sort of a unified sequence. But of course it might not be in all cases. So sometimes the token system fails, and you can turn it off here if it's not appropriate for your workflow. Generally the security measures in place around account logins and all the permissions in Formulaiz for which groups can add entries and which groups can update entries belonging to which other groups. Normally those security measures are enough, and you probably don't need to worry about other precautions, but certainly the anti-CSRF cross-site request forgery, the anti-CSRF tokens is available and is on by default just as an extra layer. By default, how many decimal places should be displayed? Yes, there's defaults here for the number of decimal places, the number, a prefix symbol like a $ maybe, what the decimal place punctuation is, and what the separator is for thousands. So these are the defaults. Again, if you change these, it's not going to change any existing elements, but it will affect any new ones that you create. They will have these new defaults in the options when you first create that element. So if you're if you're in a different locale than North America, or normal English speaking defaults, well, it's only normal if you're English speaking, isn't it? If you're in a different locale and you have some other settings that you want to use there, for especially for currency, then this is where you would specify that. Help link appear at the top of each column in the list of entries. Yes, normally there is this question mark link gives more information about the column. It actually doesn't. It shows you a few different things. We might add more stuff to it later, but for example, if you click that, it tells you text for this question as it appears in the form. So that's the actual caption, not the column heading, although for this particular element it's the same thing. But if you had a difference between the column heading and the caption, you could see the caption there. And the options for answering this question are those. So it gives you a little bit of information about the element, but not too much at the moment. So you can turn off those question marks if they're distracting or just not appropriate for your system. Use caching to speed up procedures. There is a procedures are covered in a different video, and there's a caching option there to procedures potentially can be somewhat slow depending on the options the user's chosen, and they can involve some very complex database queries, so there's caching available for those. When users are exporting data, use a compatibility trick for some versions of Excel. Yes, depends on, there we go, get rid of the tip. Well, I suppose I could leave it up for people to read, but I'm talking and you're reading, and you can always go here yourself to read what the options are or what the help text is. But yeah, briefly, the compatibility trick for Excel is it's to do with Unicode and UTF-8. When you're creating a spreadsheet, or rather a CSV file, a text file, and you want Excel to interpret it as UTF-8, depending on what characters are in it and depending on the character set of your operating system and various other things, there's just sometimes you might need that CSV file to be created in one way or in another way. For certainly normal Western European non-accent, well, for non-accented characters, it's usually not a problem. As soon as you introduce accented characters, you might need this feature turned on. Now there's a checkbox when you export. If you export entries, there's a checkbox here to use the compatibility mode. And basically, if we turn that on, and let's just save these preferences, and then we go back to the form and we go export, now that checkbox is checked by default. So that's what that preference does. And it's really just a matter of experimenting with your data. If you don't have any accented characters, you can probably ignore it. If you do, then depending on what spreadsheet program your users are using, what version of Excel, etc., you may or may not want that option to be on by default, so users don't have to click it. They can just go straight to download the file and it will just work. So that's up to you and your situation. Enable notification. I believe this is a option that's redundant based on depends on the version of Zoops or Impress CMS that you're installed with, or in the standalone version, based on how that's set up. That's not relevant. But yeah, there's different notification options here, which I don't believe are going to affect the standalone version, but are more relevant depending on the version of Zoops or Impress that you're installing in separately. Formulize is available as a module for those versions, not just as a standalone version that these videos are related to, and so that's what those controls are about. But you can generally ignore them. The way they are from the beginning should be correct. And I believe, well, we'll find out when we get to the notification video. I may be wrong about this, but I believe that's actually going to be ignored. If I'm wrong, then, well, enabling notification is what you want to do, and when we're actually looking at a bug, that it should be on by default. So we'll see. Look in the notification video for full details about that. But generally speaking, that's the rundown of what the preferences are, and you generally set them up and then you leave them alone. And the most common ones that people interact with are the all done button one, and possibly the security token one, and setting up different locale options for numbers. That's about it.